Welcome to Transform Transformational, a Teach Beyond podcast. I'm Kian.
And I'm Heather. We're here to explore what it means to be transformed in our own lives and how that overflows to living lives of transformational impact in our communities.
Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you too.
As we are transitioning into a new year, we get to talk about transitions for TCKs.
Yes, and we have talked about TCKs or third culture kids a number of times on this podcast throughout the years. As you may know, third culture kids are those who spend a significant point of their developmental years outside of their parents' passport country.
We have had a number of past episodes about TCKs and supporting them with transition, grief, processing, and returning to their passport countries. We will have a list of those episodes in the show notes. There are a lot of great resources there, so after listening to this episode, be sure to check them out.
Our guest today is Marci Renée, who has published 9 books, 5 children's picture books that tell the stories of her own third culture kids, and 4 books for adults. Today, we're going to be talking with Marci about her most recent children's book, My Tower Is Tumbling.
Marci currently lives in Spain and works in government-run safe houses with women and children who are rescued victims of human trafficking. She also coaches and debriefs third culture kids with various member care organizations.
Marci has traveled to more than 30 countries and has lived in the United States, France, North Africa, and Spain with her French husband and 4 boys. She loves to travel, speak foreign languages, experience different cultures, eat ethnic food, meet people from faraway lands, and of course, write and tell stories.
And now over to the conversation with Marci.
Welcome to the podcast, Marci.
Thank you, Heather and Kian. Looking forward to being here.
Hi, Marci. We are excited to have this conversation. So you've written 5 children's books, and today we're going to talk about the most recent one in particular. But before we dive into TCKs, can I ask you if you just have a favorite children's book in general, one you liked growing up or one you like reading to your kids?
This is such a big question.
It's
Kian.
so
I can't
hard.
believe it.
I know, no pressure. No pressure. You can pick top 5 or something.
I love children's books. I've
Yeah.
actually always wanted to be a librarian, like the old school one that would go chick, 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 you know?
Yes.
I think if I lived in the United States, that's where I would be, in the children's section of a library. I love children's books. So, I mean, I grew up with all the classics like Curious George, Spot, Dr. Seuss. So I love those. I've always shared those with my kids. But probably my favorite right now, modern children's author, is someone by the name of Pierre Reynolds. And he's written some incredible books. The Word Collector is probably my absolute favorite, but he's written The Happy Dreamer, Dot-ish. I don't know if you've heard of any of those, but they're just full of color and life. I especially love The Word Collector, though, because it's about this little boy who just through life, he collects words, and then he starts to see that they fit together in sentences and stories, and his words are released, and the world has changed. And that's very much how I see life and how I see story.
That's perfect. The Word Collector is a great book. It's a really beautiful book. I love it.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
I'm glad you are familiar with it, Kian. I hope everyone listening goes out and gets a copy.
Yes.
I didn't recognize the author's name at first, but then when you started listing the book titles, I was like, oh yeah, those are familiar.
Yeah, he's incredible.
Okay, so as we kind of dive into this topic, and we're going to be talking about TCKs, can you talk about your own experience related to a TCKs and why are you passionate about this topic?
Yeah, I am not a TCK myself. I grew up very much in a monocultural context in Kansas City, Missouri, and fell in love with France. So I had an interest in other cultures and languages from a very early age. Fell in love with France and wanted to go live there. And that was a dream that I caught a hold of and I never let go. So I wanted to be a French teacher. Went over when I was 19. My mom said, I never should have put you on that plane when you were 19 because you never wanted to come back. So my world from age 19 on has just been with travel, living abroad for several decades in Europe, in North Africa, and raising kids in that context. So I come really with the experience of a TCK mom. And we have 4 boys, so they are scattered in ages from 25 down to 10. So 25, 23, 18, and 10. We're crazy, all boys. And I just have walked alongside, not only as a parent, just watching my kids walk through the beauty and the sorrows of the TCK life. But I also love walking not only with my own kids, but other TCK kids. I love coaching kids, working in TCK schools and doing book readings, or just walking alongside them. So my experience is varied, but not as a TCK myself, but as a TCK advocate and parent.
Yeah, I love your heart for advocacy and for being with and for other people. We can hear that coming out just in how you're talking about TCKs and how you serve them. And we've talked about the grief tower with Lauren Wells on a previous podcast episode and how grief can stack up in transitions. You're alluding to this with some of the unique challenges and griefs that come from being a TCK. Can you describe for us a little bit about some of those unique griefs that can stack up for TCKs?
Yeah, I mean, I think no one is immune, right, from grief and loss, whether they're TCKs or they're not TCKs. It's just a part of the life story, and that goes for adults and children as well, of all ages. It's just part of the human experience, and so. Um, what is unique, I think, to TCKs is that there is so much transition. Like, I think of
Mm,
all the many different places and countries my own kids have lived. I didn't experience, as someone growing up in one place, one city, with one family unit, one school. I didn't experience all of those changes and all the goodbyes, and saying goodbye to grandparents on the other side of the world.
mhm,
So there's such an accumulation of grief and loss for TCKs. But I think the whole idea of this grief tower, this concept, that I think is absolutely beautiful. And I partnered with Lauren in the writing of my Tower Is
mhm,
Tumbling. But it's just it shows this accumulation, right, of the losses and the griefs, and if they are left unprocessed, like if we don't take this intentional time to look at them, to name them, to count them, I mean, to count our losses, they do begin to accumulate. And that research is showing, that Lauren has really brought out in her whole grief tower, in the writing and all that she does in that work, is that eventually, if it's not processed, those unprocessed griefs and losses, they accumulate, and they eventually are going to come tumbling down. And they're finding in that age range of like 18 to 25, it just takes a little crisis experience. It doesn't even have to be a big boom, right? It can be as simple as an 18-year-old leaving their family, going off to college, something like that. But it's going to be enough to kind of ignite enough of a rumbling of that tower that it's going to just come crashing down. And like Pierre in the book I wrote, my Tower Is Tumbling, when that happens for him, he is left sitting on the floor, just surrounded by the rocks of this tower that has tumbled around him. And now he's forced to face them and begin to process the grief and loss.
Yeah, it's so helpful to hear a little bit more about how that tower tumbling can be such an impactful experience, like in a overwhelming negative way, for him as he's sitting there.
Could you describe a little bit about in the book what actually happens in your book? Because we
Right.
kind of talked about the grief tower, but actually in your book, what that looks like.
Sure. So Pierre, which I will say, even though the book character, he's actually the book character of all of my TCK books. So The Boy Who Weaves
Okay.
the World, The Boy of Many Colors. He looks exactly like our fourth son. So orange tiger hair and blue glasses. And so my other kids are like, when are you going to write a book about me? But I've explained to them that their stories are all woven into these books. So
Nice.
Pierre, like my other three boys, so has traveled the world and has accumulated all of these losses. So it's, saying goodbye to friends he loves, schools he loves, houses that were very familiar to him and comfortable, leaving pets behind like chameleons that couldn't travel on an airplane, saying goodbye to grandparents, on multiple, continents. Because in our case, I'm American, but my husband is French, so they have already grandparents that are
Mhm,
scattered to the four
mhm.
winds. So there was just a lot of grieving and saying goodbye, different parts of the world. So as things accumulated and Pierre never really talked about these things, his mom and dad mom being myself, okay, this was a very personal story, didn't know what to do. I didn't even know how to process my own loss when we were evacuated overnight from North Africa for security reasons and didn't have an opportunity to process or say goodbye. I didn't even know how to process my own world that had just flipped upside down in a matter of, seconds. So I didn't know what to do to help my kids process their stories. So Pierre has this tower that's little by little is building, and his parents tried to get him to talk about it. Would you like to talk about those rocks that you keep carrying? Because the tower kept stacking and it kept getting heavier and heavier, but he didn't want help. And then eventually the tower comes tumbling down, and his mom and dad come, and then they sit together on the floor in the middle of this, all the rubble of the life that's not only Pierre's but also theirs, and they begin to process little by little the stories.
As you're talking about, like, you don't know how to process your own grief, so how do you process it with your kids?
Right.
And maybe even sometimes kids, we talk about kids being resilient, and kids can handle some things better than adults can. Do you address these issues even when the kids seem fine? Do you say, like, hey, this tower you're building might be hidden in the closet and we're not talking about it, but like let's talk about this. Do you have recommendations for that? Yeah.
Yeah, and honestly, I wrote this book because it's the book I wish I would have had. Like when I just described the experience, okay, we were evacuated overnight out of North Africa. There was no time to process anything. So we land in another country, and I just remember we're all in shell shock, and it was like the way I describe when there is kind of a rapid transition that's unexpected and unwanted. It is like an avalanche. It is like the tower has not just accumulated, but it's just piled on you, and you just have to kind of start digging your way out. But I just remember feeling like I didn't know how to process my own. I didn't know how to help my kids. So we did what I think we all do in times like that. We stuff it all in our suitcase, right? Because we got to carry it anyway, and we got to pack those suitcases, and we take it to the next place. And it just starts getting heavier and heavier. Well, you know what? My kids seemed like they were doing fine. I actually seemed to be doing fine too. But what happened was eventually, if those accumulated losses and griefs are not processed, they begin, I describe it as they begin to kind of contaminate you, and they start to seep out your pores. And whether you want to or not, other people are going to start noticing, and eventually you're going to have to face them. So my kids actually seem to be doing really well. I'm thinking about my youngest son right now. He's very much a talker, and I know that all kids have different personalities and expression of emotions and feelings, and that's why in the book even we've included questions to just get you started, or an emotions face charts for kids who might not have the vocabulary to express the feelings but could at least maybe identify with a facial expression. But the reason the book can be a conversation starter is because even if the kid maybe doesn't recognize, or maybe you as a parent don't recognize that there's grief and loss, or the kid definitely doesn't. If you just started reading a book like that, it can begin, whether the child enters into the story or not. They might just read it as, or listen to it as any story written in the third person. It's Pierre's story. Or they might begin to identify parts of Pierre's story in their own life. They might start talking. I encourage parents to be very open and transparent and honest about their own griefs and losses. Obviously, in an age-appropriate, kid-friendly way, right? And on topics that are appropriate for the kids and their ages. But if we as parents are able to share some of our own journey of processing our griefs and losses, that's going to create safety and trust. The kids are going to say, okay, mom and dad don't have it all together. Or maybe my big brother doesn't have it all together too. And it's going to create safety where they might be more willing to open up and share their own hard experiences and hard stories.
What would you say about the times when it seems like there should be something for the kids to process, but they're not really saying anything, and so maybe it, like in the cases where it wasn't actually as big of a deal as we might expect for them, kind of getting to that point of not creating something to process when there isn't something there, like fabricating a sense of, okay, well, you must have something that needs to be talked about.
Right. And that's a really good point, Heather. I think that, in Pierre's story, which I think is so common, again, whether TCKs or not, we're all experiencing grief and loss. And so we might not identify that some of these transitions and losses and goodbyes have affected us. We might not feel it, but underneath it's kind of like brewing, or it's kind of simmering, and it's kind of this pot that eventually is going to explode whether we realize it or not. But it's true that, I recently did a reading of this book in a TCK school here in Spain. And some of the kids said, I don't know that I've experienced some of these. I don't think I really have a lot of unprocessed loss and grief to work through. And I think we do need to really respect the child. If we don't want to fish for something that's not there, but we
Yeah.
also don't
Yeah.
want to leave any stones unturned that need to be looked at and
Sure.
need to be processed. But yeah, that's a
Yeah.
really good point. Just really being in tune with the child's needs and continuing to keep that open door of conversation and safety and trust, so that when the child's ready, it will come out.
Even laying the groundwork for something in the future. If there isn't something now, it's at least a deposit towards building that safety and trust and openness and awareness.
Yes, yes, definitely. And, Heather, it's making me think of, all of Lauren Wells' research has been that it's not, if you were to look at these kids, with this accumulated grief or this grief tower, they're not seeing the loss and grief necessarily. The others around them aren't seeing, but it's stacking and building. And so the research is showing that there is this accumulation kind of underlying. And then there's this crisis or just this big experience, just enough to kind of like, kind of like that, when you're playing the Jenga tower game, right?
Yes.
It's
Yes.
just enough to kind of destabilize and get the weight and the movement of the tower just enough to come crashing down. And then as they're faced with that, then they start to realize that, wow, there was some grief and loss that I had not felt, and maybe parents are not detecting as well.
I like this is obvious in the metaphor of the tower. And also, as we're talking about books all the time, it's like you have a bookcase. I have a bookcase in my room. And then when I move, you take all the books off and it's spread all over the floor. And you're like, wow. And you realize there was so much stuff on this one vertical stack.
Yeah.
Or like
Yeah.
the Jenga tower, where it's like, it's a small footprint. And then when it
Yeah.
falls, it's scattered everywhere.
Right.
And it's just always surprising. When you clean your room, you can put everything in a big pile and actually the room looks pretty clean. But
Yep.
there's a ton of stuff in that power, in
Yep.
that tower.
Yeah, no, that's a really, really good analogy. Yeah. And speaking of the tower, like what I love with kids, I don't know if you guys are familiar with like stacking rocks. You can find them on Amazon or wherever, but actually Lauren Wells sent me my own special box of just from her, which has been very special. But I love the tactile experience with kids. And again, whether it's talking about Pierre's story, like if it's removing it a little bit, making it in the third person, it's about this other child, right? This was Pierre's story. If that seems safer before bringing it into a more personal kind of I story, a first person story. But the tactile, stacking of rocks, you can use Legos, you can use actual, rocks that you go out and find in your garden, all kinds of things. Jenga towers work really well, but there's some really fun, colorful stacking rocks that you can find that have just been super helpful just for the tactile experience of just looking at the individual rocks and the individual pieces of someone's tower.
And let's take a short break for a story from the field.
My name is Christine Blair, and I serve at Evangelical Christian Academy in Madrid, Spain. Earlier this year, right after Marci had finished her new children's book on the Grief Tower, she reached out to our guidance counselor about some opportunities to read it in classrooms. So with the timing, it just worked out for her to be able to come share in my 7th grade Bible class. I told the students that we were going to be having a guest speaker come to our class, but I didn't tell them who it was. They were really excited when they realized it was Marci, a parent at our school who many of them are quite familiar with, though I'm not sure that many of them knew that she writes children's books. Her illustrations were beautiful, and she gave great context on what inspired her to write the story. Throughout the book, there's this metaphor of rocks that Pierre, the main character, carries around, forming his grief tower. The students were really able to connect with this metaphor since many of them are third culture kids and have been through similar experiences. After the reading, Marci gave some time for guided discussion and allowed the students to share whatever was on their heart after listening to the story. At first, discussion was slow, but slowly they became more vulnerable with each other and really started sharing experiences from their past that maybe had caused grief. For some of them, this was a favorite restaurant they don't get to visit very often, or family traditions they had to leave behind. For others, it was the loss of a pet or grandparent while overseas, or relationships that they don't feel like they get to have with their cousins. Even for me as an adult, I found this story really relatable because of some circumstances I was going through at the time. I was engaged and hoping to return to Spain for the next school year with my husband, but with some changes in his job, we had recently gotten the news that we would not be able to return on the timeline we had hoped. This was hard for me to process because it was a change in my own plans, and this is what really connected with me as Marci was reading. So after the students discussed, I shared this with them and was able to process things that I was grieving with them. So I think this book is a really helpful tool for facilitating discussion and sharing around past grief or even current situations that can be hard, not only for third culture kids, but also for their parents, educators, and other adults who are dealing with change or past grief.
For our weekly spotlight, we are focusing on Life International School in Madrid, Spain. Want to learn more? Click on the link in the show notes or visit teachbeyond.org/go. You mentioned this tactile interaction. What other suggestions do you have for parents, teachers, as they're reading this book, talking through this topic, interacting with it? You mentioned questions, you mentioned the physical, tactile. Yeah, what has worked well that you've seen in interacting with this topic?
Yeah, I'm a teacher by trade, so I love kinesthetic, tactile learning. So I think just bringing that, especially even and it's crazy. We did this recently. We had a big conference for our organization, so all the families that were there, they divided us into tables with different families, and they used My Tower Is Tumbling as the conversation starter. And it was crazy to not just my own family, but to observe the other families. The parents were getting into it, the young adults, the preteens,
Awesome.
the elementary kids, the toddlers. Like, we all love just kind of manipulating something, right? Manipulative. So I think that's obviously a great way to get started. Just this story in itself, I think when you just don't know where to begin, and that was really my heart behind wanting to write this, was to just get the conversation started, kind of like that, that starting block of a race. But just this idea of talking about the questions, I think are very, very clear. Lauren Wells, I collaborated with her, and she contributed a prayer guide, which I think is really helpful just to really unpack parts of it. But it can be used as a family. It could be used. It was amazing when I read, not the most recent reading experience, but in another school. And we had, I think, 14 kids, fifth graders, and I wasn't sure how it was going to work in that big of a group, but it was amazing. I had my own rocks that I was using for the story time, and then I kind of passed around rocks and let people talk about one or two of their own experiences and their own griefs. And so, yeah, there's just all kinds of ways. But I did this with the senior class last year. It was actually my son's senior class. There were 5 of them. And it was amazing to see as they were thinking about all the losses of their, what upcoming losses, because that's something to think. Like, is this something that you want in the middle of your big transition and experience? Is it something you want on the front end? And I always think that anything we can do to prepare. We know there are going to be griefs and losses ahead, especially if there are moves, if there are those type of geographic transitions and things upcoming for a family. So there's something about preparing yourself. It makes the landing a little bit softer. It doesn't blindside you. Like, I explained, like our overnight evacuation from North Africa, our whole family was blindsided by this avalanche of grief and loss, and we didn't have time or opportunity to process. But if we can prep our children and ourselves, I always include the adults in this, right? We're experiencing this right along with our kiddos. Um, but it just helps prepare that when those losses, when those goodbyes come, we know they're going to hurt. They're still going to hurt, but it just makes it less of a smack, smack in the face, I guess. So
There are so many ways to extend a conversation, and I think this book has given a great starting place, whether it's engaging with the story, even in quote unquote just, even in just a reading of the story, but also having the questions to extend conversation, the option to use blocks or anything you can stack as a visual for this, right?
yeah.
That's really
And
helpful.
I used, and I know it kind of breaks off from that tower image, but the suitcase, I mean, that's just another way you could take
Sure.
those rocks. And we all, I mean, all of us who are, working in multiple countries, we all know about packing and we all know about suitcases. And so you could take those rocks and put them in a suitcase and just begin to accumulate over and over. So I think the analogy can go in lots of different creative ways.
There's something powerful about having a visual that
For
is like,
sure.
oh yeah, that's how I actually feel. So
Yep.
that's great. You alluded to the fact of having to leave very quickly in your departure from North Africa. And I'm wondering about what this looks like for the griefs that come from a traumatic departure as opposed to a planned, maybe more typical ending where you're able to have closure and you can anticipate it and prepare for it. What advice do you have in regards to that?
Yeah, and I think there is a big difference. I kind of described earlier that when we had this overnight evacuation, it was like an avalanche, right, of grief and loss, and just feeling overwhelmed myself as a parent and not knowing what to do
Mm,
with my own and how to help my kids. So I think that there needs to be, and it's something that our family didn't have. Member care wasn't something we were talking a lot about back then.
mm,
We were kind of left in this new country on our own without anyone to walk alongside of us, and we couldn't help as parents. We really needed someone to step in to our family space and help us process. And so honestly, I will say that for some of my kids, some of my older kids, there were gaps left, I would say, in their heart and their soul because there was so much unprocessed loss and grief. Eventually, we had to talk about it. And I think more and more people are, talking about member care. They're getting debriefing and people coming in for that kind of thing, trauma debriefing. But we didn't have that. If we had, I think our experience would have been very, very different. We needed something like this, a resource, tools, just equipping of how to process that. So I think when there is just kind of a quick transition, there does need to be some immediate attention, almost like some emergency debriefing come in and help the family to begin to process. It's not going to happen even in the first days because you're just in survival mode, right? But in the coming weeks and months, there needs to be regular, care of just bringing in resources and equipping for parents to know how to carry on this conversation of processing grief and loss. Then the other side of that, right? If it is a planned, maybe desired, maybe undesired, but at least it's a planned, expected transition. I think so much more can be done. Not only can there be proper goodbyes, can there be proper just processing of what those griefs and losses are going to look like. Sometimes you don't realize what they are until you're on the other side of the pond, right? And then you realize all the things you miss and all the people you miss and all the favorite foods and things like that. You miss hearing Arabic, or you miss those smells in the market, that you suddenly love because you don't have them anymore and you're longing for them again. But any of the griefs and losses that are going to be very evident, leaving your best friend, no longer being able to sleep in that bedroom, that special space that has been yours for 10 years or whatever, you can prepare those. I know a lot of families, I encourage them when I know they're going through transition, if I'm doing any type of family coaching with TCKs, will encourage them to even make like a memory box, something special where they're collecting different items or different things, and they just want to keep a special memory box of the place and the land that they love and that they're leaving. So I think so much more can be done when there is time. But even I will say, even for us, even with that overnight evacuation, Thankfully, we were able to go back into the country that we had to leave. We were able to go in a couple of times with the kids, and we were able to process, say goodbye, and that was a huge part of healing in all of our hearts. So it's a journey, right? I mean, the whole grief journey. It's such a. I always say it's one step forward, and sometimes it's 10 steps back, because something will trigger the grief and it begins to resurrect, and you realize that, wow, I thought I'd processed that, but here I go again on the grief roller coaster. So
As we're talking about this and how it does come from so many personal stories and personal places for you and for your kids, and you even mentioned the main character in the book is kind of based mostly on your fourth child, looks like your fourth child. Do your kids like see themselves and like their feelings in these books, in these characters? And then I'm kind of curious how that rolls out in like seeing other kids relate to it. And you're like, oh, this is a deeply personal experience, but also somehow experienced by other people. Kind of what that
yeah,
journeys look
yeah.
like.
Yeah, it's amazing. My oldest son, he's very much a part of My Tower Is Tumbling because of his very best friend, a little boy named Omar. And it's in the book because he had a rock at the very end that said Omar, and he put it on a special place on his shelf just to keep it, because he didn't want to let go of his rocks, and that was part of it. Those are our stories that are ours forever, and even though they might represent some hard things, we want to keep them. And so I can remember, after finishing the writing and the editing of the book, I had kept the name Omar in the story, but I sent it off to my son and I said, I really want you to read this. Nobody else has seen it at this point other than me. And I really need you to tell me if you prefer that I use a different name. We can call the little boy from North Africa, Muhammad or Saeed or whatever. I have Omar right there, but I just need to know if you're okay with that. I need your permission. And he said, it has to be Omar. It has to be Omar. And so it was a very personal story. So that's just one example of my oldest son, who's very much a part of this journey with Pierre in My Tower Is Tumbling. So personal stories. However, I think that for TCKs in general, I really tried to make these stories ones that were personal and were very real and authentic, but could be universal to, I think, not only TCKs, but I know that I was surprised even when this book was being read and kind of ranking really high in just moves and transitions. And I thought, well, that doesn't apply just for TCK. It's like people are moving across country or they're moving down the street or whatever. They might just be changing schools. So I think a lot of the stories in My Tower Is Tumbling are universal enough to where, yeah, kids can identify very easily and relate to his story and hopefully process their own stories and griefs along the way.
Yeah, yeah, that's great. Marci, thank you so much for sharing all of this from your own experience, from what you've seen with others interacting with this book. We're just so thankful for a resource like this existing in the world so that TCKs that we know and others hearing about this, passing it along, will continue to be able to benefit from the process of unstacking, dealing with, working through things that are losses, and just being able to be healthy in this process. So thank you so much for that.
Oh, I want it to be shared.
Mhm.
I wrote it. I know I mentioned it earlier, but I wish I would have had
Yeah.
this when I had my boys as littles, and just want it, yeah, to be shared and be a resource to equip parents and teachers, caregivers, just to get started with the conversation that's so needed.
Marci, we are so thankful for your time. But before we let you go, we have one final question we like to ask all of our guests, and that is, what's one thing that's changing your life right now? So this can be something really big and heavy and deep, or something light and simple, just something that's making a difference, changing your life this week. I'll go first, and then I'll be Heather, and then you can go last, so you have a little bit of time to kind of think through what you might want to share. And the thing that's changing my life is just kind of a thought that somebody shared a few weeks ago, and has kind of been rolling around in my head for the number of weeks. And it's where you see yourself in stories, and it's where you see yourself in historical events and narratives and things of like, do you see yourself always as like the hero that's the good person, or do you realize sometimes you're the bad person in the history in these stories, or you're the outside observer not doing the right thing or doing the right thing? And it's just something that's made me rethink stories I've heard before or stories I'm listening to for the first time, and realizing like, oh, I always put myself as like the hero or the oppressed person versus ever putting myself as like, oh, the oppressor or like the person who's doing the problematic activity. So that's been something that's changing my life over the past few weeks as I've been
That
thinking.
was, yeah, that we haven't done a lot of concepts on here, but I like that, Kian. That
It
would
is,
change,
yeah,
be
very
changing your life.
interesting. I like that too.
Mine's lighthearted this week, and it's I have an electric fireplace, like a fake fireplace in my living room. I rent my apartment, and so it's something that I added in, and it was just a really nice addition during this. It's winter where I live here in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and so it just makes for a cozy atmosphere, and that's been changing my life lately. What about you,
That's
Marcy?
awesome. Well, I was just going to say, I have the same thing, Heather, in my writing shack.
Oh,
It's
nice.
out in our little courtyard because I don't have an office space, but it's always cold out there,
Yes.
especially right now. And I have one of those and it just, yeah, just
It's so
cozy.
nice.
Oh, change. Kind of a big one right now. I would say my kids' choices are bringing lots of change in my life. One of them is just found out a few days ago is going to get married this next summer. So I just realized we're kind of going into a different season as a family because, you know, he's going to be leaving our family in a sense to start his own. And I realize, yeah, there's big changes. So we're all going to be together at Christmas and I'm just, ready to kind of enjoy that experience before some upcoming big changes.
Congratulations to him and to your family.
Thank you.
But yeah, there's always all the emotions and mixed experiences that come from big changes like that. So
yeah, I think some grief and
Yeah.
loss might be coming
Yeah.
up too. I have to get my book out and process my own, get out my stacking rocks.
Yes, that's great. Well, thanks again, Marcy, for joining us. And we'll be sure to link to this book in the show notes so that everyone can look into that and get a copy for themselves.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Thank you. Marcy has generously offered to give away 2 copies of My Tower Is Tumbling. There is a free coloring book that accompanies the book. If you click on the link in the show notes to the coloring page and fill out the form, you'll not only receive the coloring book, but also be entered into the giveaway.
This is a great book to add to your classroom library, to gift to a friend who's transitioning, to have for your own family if you're raising TCKs. And it's actually available in English, Spanish, and French.
You can find Marcy and her books on her website, culturalstoryweaver.com. She's offering a deal. Buy one book, whether it's an ebook or print copy, and you'll get a free ebook. All you have to do is email your receipt to podcast@teachbeyond.org, and we'll be sure to get that gets to the right place.
As we mentioned at the beginning of the episode, we'll also include in the show notes links to past episodes with other guests on the topics of TCKs, grief, and transition. So all those links to the giveaway, to Marcy's website, to the past episodes are going to be found in the show notes for easy reference. Just as a reminder, you can access the show notes in your podcast player, or you can visit teachbeyond.org/podcast.
Heather and I serve with an organization called Teach Beyond. As followers of Jesus, Teach Beyond is a global community providing transformational education services as part of God's ongoing mission to transform individuals and communities into all He intends.
Want to learn more and get involved? Visit teachbeyond.org or follow us on social media.
To help more people find the podcast and hear about Teach Beyond, we'd love it if you would leave a rating or review and share the show with a friend. Be sure you're subscribed or following the show on the platform where you listen so you never miss an episode.
And as always, you can reach us at podcast@teachbeyond.org. We'll see you next week.
The mystery word for this week is becoming.